Caught desperate alien mother stole veggies, then cried, "Human, my children are dying of hunger." The greenhouse shouldn't have felt tense. It was always warm, quiet, a place where breath came easier. But this morning the air was wrong. Nolan stepped through the misted threshold and something beneath his skin prickled. The sort of instinct that had once helped him keep five-star kitchens from burning down around him. It wasn't just the heavy scent of wet soil or the low hum of the climate system. It was stillness, a wrong kind of silence, the kind that watched. He moved deeper into the rose. Cool moisture clung to his skin. Lamps overhead buzzed gently, casting gold light over vibrant rows of charred and sprouting tomatoes. He scanned the paths. No broken glass, no forced entry, but a faint scuff in the soil near the peppers caught his eye. A boot print small, not his. He took another step and heard it, a breath muffled, stifled. He turned the corner near the trellis squash, and that's when he saw her. She crouched low to the ground, one hand still buried in the soil, the other cradling torn leaves and a battered tomato like sacred relics. She wasn't human. Her skin was a muted shade of violet, cool-toned and dusted with dirt. Long white hair fell like silk across her shoulders, tangled but striking even in disarray. Her frame was tall, too thin, her bones visible through the threadbare cloth of her tunic. Two children huddled behind her legs. The boy, 6 maybe, stood stiff, wary as if ready to throw himself between his sister and Athret. The girl, barely 3, clutched her mother's side. Her white hair knotted and matted with dust, wide, violet eyes fixed on Nolan. The woman flinched when she saw him, but she didn't run. Her gaze locked on his face. Her breathing quickened, but her spine straightened, not with defiance, but with the last flicker of dignity. "Please," she said, voice cracked and raw from disuse. "Please, I've no pride left." The children pressed closer to her as she slowly lowered herself onto her knees, a protective arm curling around them. "My children are hungry. Let the stolen vegetables be forgotten." There was no hysteria in her voice, just finality, the kind that only came from someone who'd been told no too many times to expect anything different. Nolan stared, unspeaking. His expression didn't shift, but a breath caught in his throat. The girl blinked up at him, silent, watching not out of shyness, out of practiced fear. Her gaze darted behind Nolan toward the greenhouse doors, then to the ceiling vents, as if waiting for something worse to follow. Not him. Something else. The woman didn't beg again. She stayed still, her arm tightening slightly as if bracing for punishment. That moment lingered. Then Nolan turned and walked away. He didn't speak, didn't glare. He just left. The woman remained kneeling, eyes darting between him and the exit. Her hands shook. He returned 2 minutes later. No weapons, just a basket. He set it down, a few meters from her. A small loaf of dark bread wrapped in cloth, a flask of cool water, a dented tin of stew still steaming slightly, and a folded blanket. He placed it gently, like offering something fragile, then stepped back without a word. She didn't move at first. The boy's eyes widened. His fingers flexed at his sides like he wanted to reach for the food but wouldn't without her permission. The girl stayed pressed against her mother's ribs, unmoving, barely blinking. The woman glanced at the basket, then at Nolan. She looked again, behind him, then toward the greenhouse doors, then to the ceiling, as if expecting drones, cameras of voice, shouting orders. Her throat worked as she swallowed. Her right wrist bore faint bruised impressions like old manacles. She finally moved. One hand extended slowly, and she took the blanket first, not for herself but to drape around the children's shoulders. Then she reached for the bread, tore off half for each child, and kept nothing. The boy took his piece hesitantly. The girl stared at hers, sniffed it, and then looked to her mother again before taking a tiny bite. She chewed without blinking. When the woman finally took the stew, her fingers barely held steady. The smell hit her, and something shifted in her face. Shock, almost grief. She brought the spoon to her lips, tasted, and flinched. Not from pain, from warmth. Her eyes watered. She took another bite too fast and choked slightly. The spoon clattered. She turned away and pressed a hand over her mouth, jaw trembling. She coughed once silently, like she didn't want him to hear, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself small. Nolan watched from a distance, arms crossed. He hadn't cooked for anyone in 5 years. Not really. Not since. No, not now. The boy's hands slipped into his mother's as he ate. The girl leaned against her side. The woman pulled them in with both arms, lowering her forehead to their heads, breathing them in. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. Later he sat at his kitchen table, staring into his empty hands, the same hands that had once prepared tasting menus for orbital diplomats. Now they were rough, cracked from pruning vines and sorting compost. He flexed them slowly, still steady, out past the window. The greenhouse glowed in the fading light. The air outside had cooled curling mist along the dirt paths between the barn and the house. The tool shed stood in shadow. Tomorrow he'd clean it out, make space. They couldn't stay in the greenhouse, not with the frost season near. Wasn't sure what this was, charity, penance, something else, but he knew what it wasn't. It wasn't a mistake, because when she'd looked at him, terrified, starved, stripped of every barrier her people probably taught her to wear, she hadn't looked like a thief. She'd looked like a mother trying to survive one more night. And maybe he had one more night of kindness left to give. Before the first hint of sun touched the horizon, Nolan was already up. The cold had crept in overnight, sharp and clean-cutting across the fields with a quiet authority that turned the soil stiff and left ice crusting on the greenhouse's outer panels. Hearthvale always whispered before it froze, and Nolan had learned how to listen. He stood by the window for a long moment, mug in hand, the warmth of coffee seeping into his palms. Through the thin veil of mist, the greenhouse glowed faintly, its internal lights casting a soft pulse behind the glass. There was no movement, no sound, just a stillness that wrapped the land like an extra layer of frost. They were still there. He knew it. He hadn't slept well. Not from regret. From something harder. To name some knot in his chest he'd mistaken for silence for too many years. Last night, he'd done something he hadn't done. In nearly half a decade, he'd cooked for someone else. Not for trade, not for spectacle, but because he couldn't bear the sight of someone starving in his field. He set the mug down and took the key to the tool shed off its nail by the door. The shed sat just past the barn, out near the compost silos where no one ever went unless they had to. It was insulated, weather-sealed, and dry, bare, but safe. He hadn't used it for anything but storage in years. Still, as he pulled open the door and stepped into the dust sent to dark, he found himself already making mental lists. What he could clear out, what he could bring in. Whether the old Kerm panel still worked, whether they'd sleep on crates, or if he had an extra mattress in the attic. He didn't question. Decision. It had already been made. When he walked back toward the greenhouse, he moved slower than usual. Not out of hesitation, but out of something resembling respect. The place wasn't just his anymore. Not really, not after what he'd seen last night. The woman hadn't asked for help and she hadn't thanked him, but she had accepted the basket, the stew, the blanket. That was enough. She was still in the same place, kneeling near the peppers, her back against one of the trellises. Her children lay bundled. Beneath the wool like two folded birds, the little girl didn't stir. The boy blinked at Nolan, awake but silent, watching. The woman's eyes met his the moment he stepped inside. "I've got a space," he said simply. "Better than this. It's dry, warm enough." She didn't speak, just studied him, calculating. Uncertain, maybe afraid of strings, he hadn't spoken aloud. Then wordlessly she rose. She lifted the girl, gently, who only nestled deeper into her shoulder without making a sound. The boy followed, one hand wrapped in the hem of his mother's tunic. No questions, no complaints, only quiet motion. The walk to the shed was brief but heavy with the weight of unspoken things. The woman glanced around, often not nervously, but alert, like someone used to being hunted. Her ears twitched at the faint chirp of a sensor post hidden in the hillside. Her grip on the child tightened. She turned her head at every mechanical hum, like each one might announce the arrival of someone she feared. Nolan pretended not to notice. He opened the shed door and stepped aside. The space was modest, concrete floor, a few crates stacked in the corners, coiled hoses along the wall, but it was clean and sealed, and it didn't smell like cold glass and fertilizer he'd already set down, a folded tarp, and 2 thick blankets. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She stepped in without hesitation. The boy followed close behind. The girl's face remained hidden in her mother's shoulder, though one pale violet eye peeked out just long enough to glance at Nolan before disappearing again. "I'll bring food soon," Nolan said, "and water." He turned to leave, but her voice caught him at the door. It was soft, quieter than before, almost unsure if it deserved to be heard. "Why are you doing this?" He stopped, didn't turn around. "Because I didn't last time," he said. Then he left back at the house. He fell into motion without thinking. The kitchen was small but orderly, still exactly as it had been when he stopped using it for anyone but himself. But his hands remembered their purpose. He set the pot to boil chopped roots with clean, steady strokes turnip, parsnip, yam. He added dried thyme, little ground salt root, then stirred in the same strip cured meat he'd put aside months ago, for an occasion he never expected would come. He worked in silence, saved for the soft scrape of the ladle and the occasional whistle of steam. Thesmel filled the house, familiar and warm, and suddenly too much. He opened a window not for the heat but to breathe. By mid-morning he returned to the shed with a tin bowl, a flask of clean water, and a cloth-wrapped bundle of fresh bread. He didn't knock, just opened the door slowly, announcing himself with the familiar sound of hinges. The boy sat on the tarp blanket around his shoulders, staring at the sunlight through a knot in the wooden wall. The girl was curled against her mother, unmoving. The woman rose to her knees as he entered, back straight, not submissive, composed. He placed the food down on an upturned crate and took a step back. She nodded, not in gratitude. Something more like acknowledgement. Respect, maybe. It didn't need words. As he turned to go, a small voice stopped him. "Why does it smell like sun?" He looked back. The boy's face was tilted slightly, nose lifted as if searching for the source. Nolan smiled faintly. "Time," he said, "grows well in mist." The boy blinked. "Time," he repeated slowly. "Is it for healing? Sometimes mostly for flavor." The girl stirred, then a tiny motion, and for the first time turned her face just enough to peer out from her mother's arms. Her white hair stuck to her cheek. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to speak but had forgotten how. Then as quickly as she appeared, she withdrew again into silence. Nolan didn't push. He stepped out and closed the door behind him. That night he couldn't help himself. He checked the crate left outside for the empty bowl and found it clean scour. Even on top sat a small pouch made of woven reeds tied with a thin cord inside, a crushed bundle of dry herbs, deep purple, sharp, bitter scent, foreign. He held it to his nose and closed his eyes. It wasn't a thank you, it was a reply. The next morning, when Nolan stepped outside with a new bowl of stew and a stack of kindling for the old thermal plate he'd installed overnight, the boy was already waiting. He held the previous night's bowl in both hands and looked up at Nolan with quiet confidence. "My name is Rain," he said. "I'm 6, my sister's name is Mary. She's 3. Nolan took the bowl and nodded. "Nice to meet you, Rain." Rain paused, then added, "She stopped talking after the ship broke." Nolan didn't ask what ship. "Not yet. She listens, though, even when she looks like she doesn't." He nodded again. "That's a good skill." To have Rain tilted his head, thoughtful. "Are you always alone?" Nolan hesitated. Then "Note anymore." Rain accepted that without question. He turned and padded back to the shed with his thin legs and steady gait, carrying the firewood Nolan had set down. Nolan watched him disappear into the doorway and stood for a moment in the chill morning air. Not everything had to be spoken to be understood. That evening, the greenhouse lights glowed always. The earth beneath his boots felt a little warmer. The kitchen no longer echoed when he walked through it, and on the shelf beside his old spice jars. He placed the pouch of purple herbs carefully, like a promise he hadn't made, out loud yet. They didn't ask to be saved, but they were here now, and he wasn't alone. The days that followed passed quietly, but not without weight. There was a rhythm to life now, a soft, unspoken cadence shared between 4 people who had learned to read silence like scripture. They didn't speak of Themament when Celine whispered her name to Nolan in the dim light of the kitchen. But something had shifted. She no longer kept her distance when handing him a bowl or passing near him in the narrow hallway. The way she moved around the house had changed, less like a guest, more like someone planting roots. Each morning, Nolan woke before sunrise, brewed coffee, and checked the greenhouse vents. Each time he caught the sound of bare feet padding softly down the hall. Rayan was always first to rise. His curiosity had become a constant presence, trailing behind Nolan like a second shadow. The boy asked about everything: soil composition, water filters, nutrient density. But his questions weren't idle. He listened, absorbed, remembered. One morning, as Nolan knelt to check the mineral filters, on the east pipe, Rain crouched beside him. "You use sand from the red basin?" the boy asked, touching the grains with one finger. "Only a little," Nolan said, glancing over. "Too much and the roots dry out, but it helps anchor shallow plants." Rain nodded thoughtfully, his white hair falling into his eyes. "My father used crushed volcanic glass, said it made the food taste richer." Nolan paused, caught by the mention. Rain didn't look up. He just ran his fingers through the soil. "You miss him?" Nolan asked quietly. Rain shrugged. "I don't know, I remember his hands, big warm. He used to carry both Ophis at once." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "He gave us to Mama before the guards came." Nolan didn't press further. Later that day, Salen joined Nolan in the greenhouse. She moved through the rows with ease, her hands knowing what to touch and what to leave. When she reached the root beds, she knelt and began to clear away old stems. Nolan watched her fingers work, strong but careful. She murmured softly to the soil, a language Nolan didn't recognize. Something rhythmic, melodic, a planting prayer, maybe, or a song. "You know this work?" Nolan said, stepping closer. "I used to," she replied before she looked up, brushing a stray lock of white hair from her cheek. "My people grew food for trade, not survival. We believe food should be a gift, not a transaction." Nolan gave a soft grunt. "Doesn't work like that out here." "No," she agreed, "but it should." That night after supper, Celine lingered in the kitchen as Nolan cleared the dishes. Mary sat by the window staring at the stars. She hadn't said a word since they'd arrived, but her silence had changed. It was no longer guarded, it was listening. Celine dried her hands on a cloth and glanced at her daughter. "She used to sing with me," she said softly. Tiny voice, always off pitch. She smiled. The first real smile Nolan had seen from her. Faint but bright, like the first break of sunlight through fog. "What changed?" he asked. "The ship, the noise, the darkness." "There was a man who screamed for days before the air ran out. After that, she stopped." The weight of those words fell hard. Nolan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I lost someone too," he said. "Not toward a food, one contaminated shipment, a child not mine, but I saw the mother's face." He looked down at his hands. "I haven't cooked for anyone since." There was a long silence. Then Celine reached forward slowly and rested her fingers over his wrist. "You fed us," she said. Nolan nodded. "I did." Later that night, he heard something he hadn't expected, a song. Not loud, not lyrical, just a faint hum like breath carried on wind. He stepped outside and found Celine kneeling in the garden. She sang to the plants. No words, just tone and rhythm, the melody of memory. Her voice wrapped around, the air full and low, brushing against the glass panels, like a heartbeat. Rain stood nearby, eyes closed, swaying gently. Mary sat cross-legged in the dirt, not moving, but her lips were slightly parted. Listening, Nolan didn't interrupt. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the three of them bathed in the golden glow of the greenhouse lights. Later, as he walked back toward the house with them, Celine touched his arm lightly. "She's remembering," she said, "because of your song, because of your soil." Inside the house, the children curled up on the couch beneath the same blanket. Celine lingered a moment by the kitchen, glancing at the jar of herbs they'd brought from their ship. Nolan noticed the way she held it, like a relic or a promise. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For giving us a place to land." Nolan didn't answer. He just reached for the kettle, filled it, and set it on the stove. The water boiled. The house stayed warm, and in the quiet that followed, Mary hummed, 3 notes, then silence. A thin rain fell for 3 days straight. The clouds hung low over Hearthvale gray and close, muting the landscape to soft shadows. Inside the house, the windows steamed with warmth in the slow breath of stew simmering on the stove. The children stayed mostly inside, curled up with scavenged story tablets, or building strange structures out of dried roots and cord string. Their laughter, though quiet, had begun to return in fits and starts, never loud but real. Sign had taken to humming again while she worked. Not full songs, not yet, but fragments, bits of melody. She tucked into the way, she stirred a pot or rinsed herbs. Nolan never asked for them, but he never stopped listening either. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Celine lingered at the table. Nolan was scraping the bowls clean, the rhythmic clink of spoon on metal. The only sound outside, the wind whispered across the field like it was searching for something it had lost. "I used to live in a home that sang," Celine said suddenly. Nolan looked up. It was carved into the cliffs, above the ocean. She continued, not meeting his gaze. Every night the wind would pass through the stonework and make music, deep tones, hollow and warm. "My people called it the breath of the ancestors." She smiled faintly. The children would listen with their heads against the walls. "That's how we learned rhythm, through stone and air." Nolan sat down the spoon and sat across from her. "What happened to it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then they took the cliffs. Said they needed the stone for military bunkers, said our village could relocate. We tried to protest, but they didn't understand protest woven into music." Her voice cracked slightly. "They burned the archives, silenced. The elders said it wasn't culture, just noise." Nolan watched her hands as she spoke. Hands that had once woven songs, now mending clothing and chopping roots. Hands still steady, still useful. He waited. Then came the relocation ships she went on. "We were told it would be temporary, that families would be kept together. I held Mary in one arm, Rain in the other. My mate, Kay, he stood between us and the officers. He told me to run if the alarm sounded." Her breath caught. It sounded less than a minute later. She finally looked at him. "I never saw him again." Nolan's heart clenched, but he said nothing. "He wasn't a soldier," she added softly. "But they took him anyway because he sang, because he resisted." She exhaled slowly. "Mary remembers his scent. That's why she carries that old cloak." It was his. Nolan nodded, throat tight. "I'm sorry. You don't need to be," she said. "But thank you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded strip of dark cloth. Inside it was a tiny piece of stone gray with faint red veins. "Kay carved this from the cliffs," she said, handing it to him. "It's all that's left. The music is gone, but the stone remembers." Nolan accepted the fragment carefully, as if it might crumble under his touch. "I used to think memories were a kind of prison," he said. "But maybe they're anchors." She smiled faintly. "Depends on the memory." A long silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then Nolan stood and crossed to the shelf above the stove. He returned with a small wooden box and opened it. Inside were scraps of printed paper, each yellowed and curled with time, recipes, clippings. One was a photo. Nolan, years younger, standing in front of a fine dining station. His smile looked real, but his eyes didn't. "That was before," he said simply. "Before the recall, before the lawsuit." Celine leaned forward. "You've mentioned it." "The child." He nodded. "A girl. 7 years. Old, allergic to a protein we didn't even know was in the shipment. The supplier lied. The label was wrong, but it was my restaurant, my name, and you lefty left. Everything. I disappeared before the verdict even cleared. Hearthvale wasn't a plan. It was the first place where no one cared who I was." He glanced at her. "You're the first person I've cooked for since." She studied him. "You still carry it?" "I do." "Does it define you?" "I thought it did." And now Nolan hesitated. "Now I think it's part of me, but not the end of me." Celine's expression softened. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "We carry names, but they don't carry us. They stayed like that for a long time. Hands joined the quiet of the house, wrapping around them like a second skin. When she rose to go to bed, she paused in the doorway. My full name, she said without turning back, was Celine Vassarith. It means voice of the earth, daughter of stone. But I left the Vassarith behind when I ran. She looked over her shoulder, eyes calm. You can still call me Salin. Nolan smiled. Only if you still call me Nolan. Outside the wind carried no song, but inside something had begun to hum again. The day began like any other mist on the greenhouse glass, dew beating along the path stones, rain asking, if root rot was contagious to tomatoes. Mary followed quietly, her tiny feet scuffing along the wooden porch as she clutched the hem of her mother's tunic. Silene hummed softly under her breath as she stirred the morning porridge, and Nolan stood by, the window coffee in hand, watching the way the eerily light hit the frost-flecked fields. It should have been peaceful, but he felt it before he saw it. A shift in the air, the faint mechanical hum carried by the wind too steady, too precise. He turned, his head sharply there on the far ridge. 2 flickers of blue, not natural, not stormlight, not farming drones, guards inside. He said, quiet but firm. Salene turned instantly. No questions, just motion. She swept Mary into her arms, called softly to Rain, and nodded to Nolan. He led them straight to the kitchen. Behind the stacked crates of dried grain was a hatch old unused for years. Beneath it, the storage cellar, cold, dark, and lined with root vegetables but hidden from scans. They'll check the house, Nolan said. Maybe the greenhouse. Stay quiet. Don't move unless I call you. Celine touched his arm once, just a press of her fingers, and vanished into the darkness with the children. He resealed, the hatch slid the crates back, and exhaled slowly. His heart beat, like it hadn't in years, not from fear but from clarity. This time he wouldn't freeze. He wouldn't let someone else pay for his silence. He turned back to the stove. The stew he'd started that morning still simmered, a blend of rich earthroot sail grain, and a pinch of Nahali spice has stirred it. Calmly added a splash of broth and then just enough of his homemade sedative to slow a heartbeat, but not stop one. The knock came 5 minutes later. He opened the door to 2 figures in regulation, gray, one human, square-jawed and sunburnt. The other crayon, taller scaled eyes that never blinked. Evening, Nolan said mildly. Report off unauthorized biosigns. The human said thermal spike last cycle. This is registered as a solo holding. Correct, Nolan. Nodded. Name's Nolan. Greaves, no visitors, just me and the crops. The crayon sniffed the air. Something's cooking, root stew. Nolan replied. Care for a bowl? The 2 guards exchanged a glance. The human shrugged. Won't say no. They stepped inside. Nolan served them each a modest portion, steam curling into the air. The Nahali spice masked the tincture. They ate quickly, too quickly, and asked routine questions. Work permits, crop volume, local wildlife. Greenhouse outputs increased, the crayon noted. You plant something new, just old tricks. Nolan said, calm, good compost and patience. They didn't press. Not at first, but Nolan saw the tension building as the sedative took hold. The way their shoulders slumped, the way their questions came slower. Appreciate the hospitality, the human muttered, rubbing his eyes. We'll file the check-in as routine. They staggered out into the evening, helmets under their arms, boots dragging slightly in the gravel. Nolan watched until the lights disappeared beyond the ridge. Then he locked the door and moved straight to the kitchen. He opened the hatch. Silent emerged first, eyes alert. Then Ryan, breathing shallowly, but steady. Then Mary, clutched against her mother's chest, silent but wide-eyed. They're gone, Nolan said. Salin stepped forward. You risked everything. No, he said, I chose. He turned back toward the table, trying to slow his breathing, but his hands trembled. I didn't savor her, he whispered almost to himself. Who? Celine asked. The girl, he said. The one who ate that meal. I didn't know her name. I just knew it was my recipe. His voice broke. Celine stepped closer. But you saved mine. He looked up, and for a moment all the grief, guilt, and silence between them lifted. She cupped his face in her hands, steady, deliberate. Then she kissed him, not like someone seeking shelter, like someone coming home. They stood like that for a long time, forehead to forehead, the only sound the steady tick of cooling metal on the stove. Mary shifted in her mother's arms, reaching up slowly. Her fingers brushed Nolan's sleeve. When she looked up at him, her lips parted. No words, just breathe. But it was the first time she'd looked at him without fear. Later, after the children had returned to their beds, Silene sat with Nolan on the porch, the night air crisp and clean. The stars blinked above, them unbothered by patrols or permits. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "Probably we'll have to be ready, we will." She leaned into his shoulder and he let her. The warmth between them wasn't sudden. It had grown slowly, like the roots beneath their feet, quiet, steady, deep. And when morning came and the greenhouse lights flickered on, the earth didn't know who they had once been, only who they were now together. The next morning was strangely quiet, not the comfortable silence Nolan had grown to appreciate on Hearthau, the kind filled with bird song and rustling leaves, but something tighter, a silence that braced, that waited, the kind that knew the sound of boots would return. He stood in the field just before dawn, steam rising from the soil, breath ghosting in the chill. The spot where the patrol had stood was already covered in dew, as if the earth wanted to forget them, but he didn't. Inside the house, Silene stood by the sink drying Mary's hair with a soft cloth. The girl had bathed that morning without prompting. She didn't speak. Still hadn't. But her eyes were brighter. She watched the light flicker across the windows like it meant something. Rain helped Nolan pack crates of dried herbs and old tools into the cellar just in case. The boy asked no questions, only glanced toward the horizon more often than usual. After breakfast, Nolan finally spoke. "We need to make them think you belong here." Sine raised her head. "You mean papers?" she said. "Worse," he said. "Bureaucracy." They sat at the dusty terminal in the back room of the farmhouse. Nolan wiped the screen with a rag, then tapped through outdated registry forms until he found the old agricultural work exchange application template. "I'll list you as seasonal workers," he said. "Helpers. I hired for planning season names. Birth tags, fabricated permits." "You've done this before," she said, watching him move through the menus years ago, when it needed a rare pepper strain imported under embargo, had to rename it Agricultural Color Enhancer. A flicker of amusement passed through her eyes. "Did it work?" "Too well. I got fined for accidentally stimulating bee colonies." He paused. "You're laughing, am I?" she asked, but her lips curved anyway. They spent hours writing fake backstories, cross-referencing station logs for nearby ship movements, aligning false entries to avoid detection. Silene's memory for detail was uncanny. She recalled the registry codes of the ship fragments that fell near Hearthvee's orbital shell. They used one to construct a fictional refugee manifest. "They won't believe this forever," she said. "They won't have to," Nolan replied. "Just long enough." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees, whistling against the solar panels. Mary pressed her forehead to the glass. She watched birds move across the fields, their flight, erratic and purposeful, like they knew something she didn't. That afternoon, Nolan returned to the greenhouse. The plants were thriving despite the tension. Fat green, full of promise. He moved row by row, pruning, checking soil moisture. Rain trailed behind, carrying a bucket of compost and humming softly under his breath. "You talk to them?" Rain asked, pointing at the plants. "Sometimes," Nolan said. "Do they listen?" Sometimes. Rain crouched by a row of young tomatoes. "Think they know Mama is safe now," he said. Nolan swallowed hard. "I hope they're right." Rain pulled a small pot from his satchel, a cutting he'd been nursing. A new seedling, pale green with soft veined leaves. "I want to plant this one here," he said. "Where we first found her." Nolan knelt beside him, pressing his hands into the soil. "What's it called?" Rain shrugged. "It doesn't have a name yet." They planted it together, tamping the earth, watering slowly. When they finished, Rain looked up. "Did you want to be alone forever?" Asked. Nolan didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "I just thought I'd served to be." Rain nodded like he understood. Back at the house, Celine was kneeling near the fireplate, tending the pot. She moved with quiet grace, every gesture intentional. Miri sat beside her, stacking pieces of firewood. In careful patterns, Nolan entered, brushing dirt from his hands. Rayanne named the new plant. He said, "What is it called?" He hesitated, then smiled. "The rescue vine." Celine blinked once, then turned away, pretending to stir the stew. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Celine stepped out onto the porch and found Nolan sitting on the top step, elbows on his knees. She sat beside him. The stars were out again, crisp and clear above the cooling land. "I used to wonder," she said, "what kind of planet my children would grow up on." He looked over. "And now I wonder if they'll stay." Nolan nodded. "I thought I would die alone out here," he said. "But now I'm worried what happens if I don't." Sine leaned against his shoulder. "I don't want to run anymore," she said. "Thendant," he whispered. Their hands found each other, fingers curling without effort, without hesitation. Inside the house held the warmth of bread and ashen breath. Outside, the soil settled around a new root. It would take time, but time now was something they had. The thaw came quietly, not with fanfare or sudden warmth, but in slow, deliberate gestures. Softening soil, longer light, the scent of water settling deeper into the land. The frost clung stubbornly in the shaded parts of the field, but it had lost its bite. Hearthvale was yielding, and so was she. The house no longer felt like a space divided by caution. It breathed with them, now lived in, layered with the sounds of quiet footsteps and evening laughter, the scent of flour on fingers and fire smoke stew in the walls. Nolan no longer startled at the noise of children's feet on the stairs. Desolences weren't empty anymore. They were full of things left unspoken only because they didn't need saying. Mary had started humming again. Not full songs, just fragments of notes, often while stacking small stones on the porch or weaving thin grass into loops she wore around her wrist. The first time she did it, Celine had frozen. Her hands trembled, so hard she dropped the ladle. She hadn't even tried to pick it up. Rain never spoke about the patrol after they left. But he asked Nolan questions about solar flares and comms interference and how far a voice could travel through a dead radio. Then he asked if plants could survive on a ship. "Depends on the ship," Nolan told him, and Rain had nodded like. That made perfect sense. By the second week of thaw, the greenhouse had taken on a life of its own. Celine had planted an entire row of hybrid herbs, part earth-grown, part carried in her memory. Their scent was unfamiliar but grounding, like something older than language. She moved among them as if tending an old wound, her fingertips brushing the stems as though listening. One afternoon, Nolan found her kneeling beside the original tomato row, the very one she'd stolen from. These were the first, she said. He crouched beside her, brushing soil from his palms. "They're holding strong," she nodded. "I thought you'd turn me in that first night." "I did too," he admitted for a moment. She looked at him, eyes steady. "Why didn't you?" Nolan was quiet. "For a long time then, because I saw how you held them. Not like cargo, not even like children, like truth." A soft breath escaped her lips, neither laughter nor sadness. She reached into her satchel and drew out a tiny carved stone. It was red-veined, like old blood through gray familiar. "My husband gave me this," she said, Kai, before the checkpoint, before they took him. Nolan didn't speak. He was a singer, too louder than me, braver. He blocked the corridor long enough for me to run. I carried the children. He carried our future. She closed her hand around the stone. "I don't know if he lived, but I made sure his children did." She met Nolan's eyes. "And now they're yours too." His throat tightened. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Inside the house, the children were quiet. Mary curled on the couch, with her eyes half closed, humming that same wordless tune. Rain had fallen asleep near the fire, a half-drawn sketch of a greenhouse in his hand. That night Nolan made stew not because they were hungry, because it had become a kind of ceremony. He stirred, slowly letting the Nahali spice bloom in the broth. When Sign stepped in from outside, cheeks pink from the wind, he poured her a bowl and set it gently in front of her. She didn't speak. Instead, she set her hand on his fingers. Strong. Sure they ate in. Silence firelight flickering across their faces. Afterward, Rain woke to find his sketch on the table beside him. Half-colored, and Mary tugged gently on her mother's sleeve, and for the first time, whispered a word so soft it might have been imagined. Home. Silene froze, then dropped to her knees and wrapped Mary in her arms. Nolan turned away, his chest tight. Later they stood in the greenhouse, hands in soil, surrounded by the soft glow of the grow lights. The tomato vines stretched high above them, now roots thick and tangled in the earth they had learned to trust. "I used to think I came here to vanish," Nolan said, "and now I think I came here to be found." She reached up and touched his cheek. "You didn't save just a life," she said. "You built one." He kissed her. Then, not in hunger, not in fear, in stillness, in peace. When they stepped back, the greenhouse hummed around them, alive. Outside, the moon hung low over Hearthvale. The patrols didn't return. The registry queries faded. The soil remembered every footstep. And inside the house, 2 children slept without fear. Not fugitives, not refugees. Family. The sun was already painting soft gold across the fields when Nolan stirred. For once he hadn't risen before dawn. No alarms, no patrol warnings, just warmth. A quiet warmth that pressed against him from either side. Small limbs tangled in his own soft, breathing rising and falling in gentle rhythm. Rain had claimed one side of the bed sometime during the night, sprawled like a miniature scarecrow, one arm across Nolan's chest. Mary had curled into the crook of his other arm, her face nestled against his shirt, her fingers lightly gripping the fabric. They were all still safe, warm. Nolan lay there unmoving, not wanting to break the spell. The house was wrapped in silence, but it wasn't empty. It pulsed with comfort the way hearth fires do after a long storm. A small murmur rose beside him. Rain blinked awake, hair sticking in every direction, eyes blurry with sleep. He looked up at Nolan and grinned. "You snore?" Nolan arched a brow. "Do I like a tractor?" Mary giggled. It was quiet, muffled against, his-eyed but unmistakable. He looked down and saw her smiling eyes still half closed. "Morning, little bird," he said gently. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. She simply reached up and touched his jaw, tracing the stubble with tiny fingers, then curled tighter against him. They stayed that way for a while, piled in a loose, sleepy heap with sunlight. Stretching slowly across the wooden floor, eventually Rain sat up and declared, "I'm starving." "Of course you are," Nolan said, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. "You slept through 2 meals. That's not true, is 2 is not." Mary slipped her hand into Nolan's as he stood. Her grip was light but steady. They padded to the kitchen together, bare feet rumpled. Pajamas, hair still full of dreams. Nolan lit the stove, pulled down the flour jar, and got to work. Ray fetched the milk. Mary stirred the eggs. They made pancakes in silence, then in laughter, then in song. Mary's hum rising quietly, while Rain made up new words to old melodies. When Silene returned from the field, a basket of herbs on her hip and earth on her hands, she paused at the doorway. There they were, Nolan at the stove, Rain dancing with a spatula. Mary perched on the counter, dusted in flower eyes. Wide and alive, her family whole. She stepped inside without a word, and Nolan looked over his shoulder, meeting her eyes with a smile that said everything. They had made it, and for the first time in their lives, perhaps ever, this day didn't begin in fear, it began in love. It was the 15th evening since the last frost, and Hearth was finally beginning to bloom in earnest. The ground, once estive with cold and caution, had softened. Wildflowers dotted the edges of the irrigation ditches. The greenhouse thrummed with life inside. It rose of tomatoes bent under the weight of ripening fruit. And yet, despite the season, Nolan had not touched a spade all day. He sat on the porch with his boots still on elbows, resting on his knees, watching the light shift across the fields. The horizon was golden quiet. The children were in the garden behind the house, Rain drawing furiously in the dirt with a stick, Mary singing softly to herself while feeding breadcrumbs to a black-feathered hen that had started following her. Inside, Celine moved about the kitchen. But when she stepped onto the porch, her hands were empty. She didn't speak at first. She just stood beside him, taking in the same view. For a long time, there was only the breeze and the rhythmic creak of an old wind catcher on the roof. Then, "I saw you watching them today," she said. He glanced up. She sat beside him and pulled her knees close to her chest. "They've changed," she said. Rain asked less about ships now. "Mary sleeps without clutching the cloak. They trust this place," Nolan said. "They trust you." A silence passed, deeper than the one before. It wasn't heavy, but it had weight like soil, thick with rain, rich and ready. He turned his head slightly. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "not just about what we've built, but what could come after it." Her breath hitched, but she said nothing. "I never thought I'd raise anyone again," he continued. "Didn't think I deserved that after what happened, after what I didn't prevent." She placed a hand gently over his. "You've been raising them every day since we arrived, I know," he said. "And I love them more than I ever expected I could." A pause. "But when I look at you, I wonder what it would mean to start something together. Not out of survival. Not because we were thrown together by tragedy, but because we chose it, because we're ready." Celine's fingers tightened around his. "There was a time," she said slowly, "when the idea of bringing another life into a world like this felt like cruelty, a sentence handed down to the innocent. I told myself I would never do it again." He nodded. He understood. "I used to sing to my womb when I was pregnant. With rain," she whispered. "Each phase of the moon had a melody I wanted him to arrive into, a world of rhythm." She looked at Nolan now fully, directly. "But I lost that voice after Kai, after the ships. I didn't think I had anything left in me worth passing on." He didn't rush her. He let her find her own way to the truth. And now he asked softly, "Now I think maybe I found my voice again. And maybe, with you, I wouldn't be passing on just the past. I'd be passing on something new." Her words were neither impulsive nor poetic. They were true, rooted in the woman she had become, still scarred, still healing, but no longer fleeing. She turned to him and smiled, a small luminous thing that reached all the way to the corners of her tired, beautiful eyes. "I would raise a child with you, Nolan Greaves," she said. He swallowed hard. "You sure I am even here, especially here?" He ached for her hand and pulled it to his lips, pressing a slow, reverent kiss into her palm. "We'll build a cradle beside the tomato vines," he murmured. "A child raised with dirt under their nails and music in their blood." Sailing laughed, a real laugh, deep and unguarded. "And spice in their soup," she added. "And stubbornness in their bones," he said. They sat that way for a while longer. Two people who had been broken now choosing to begin again. Not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. The wind shifted, the stars blinked alive, and inside the house, Rain called for dinner. Mary's voice followed, soft but certain. They rose together and stepped inside to a life they would now grow, not just for themselves, but for someone not yet born, already loved.